Hey everyone, today I'm going to be showing how you can use a customer's saved payment details to process marketplace payments with Stripe Connect. What you're seeing in front of you is a marketplace app. It's kind of like an Etsy or like an Amazon style app where a seller, in this case the jumper shop, has put up a jumper for sale. And if I click this purchase one click button, what we're going to see is this $80 payment is going to go through and it's going to be split automatically between the jumper shop and my platform. And the customer didn't have to enter their payment details because we had already saved them down. And if we look at our Stripe dashboard and just look for the relevant account, which is this one here, we'll see that a payment has just gone through. If we go to payments, we can see the Brad Pitt at gmail.com account. You can see 72 euros has gone through, which is about $80. And then back in our transactions, if we go to collected fees, then we're going to see that $16, which is 20%, went to the platform itself. We've also put together a really detailed written guide on this topic. I'm going to link to that in the description below. And it's also going to be useful for this video because I've kind of written out the steps involved and we can go through them one by one. You can see here step one is structuring your database. So what I've done is I've just created a database schema on a Miro whiteboard here. I'm not going to go through each of these fields, but I just wanted to draw your attention to a few key ones, particularly on the user data type. These two data fields here are going to be really important for the customers. They're not going to be as necessary for the sellers on your platform. But if you want a customer to be able to use saved payment details, they're going to need a customer ID, which is a Stripe field, and also a payment method ID, which is something else we're going to get from Stripe. I'm not going to go through the rest of the fields in detail, but just to note, we've actually created a demo app for this exact payment flow, which is what I'm going to be using throughout this video. I'm going to link to this below, and I'm going to make the editor public. So if you want, you can just click on that button, and you'll actually be able to see all the workflows behind the various actions that we're going to be going through today. Okay, so that's step one. Step two is we want to create a new Stripe customer when a user signs up for your app. Now, for all actions that actually involve interacting with Stripe, I'm going to be using the Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin, which is a Cranford Tech plugin. You can see here I've installed in my app, but if you'd like to install it yourself, you can go to the Add Plugins button in your Bubble editor and search for Stripe Connect Marketplace. We have a ton of demo videos, documentation, and other good things to help you get up and running. There's a small bit of configuration to get involved with getting this running in terms of API keys. I'm not going to go into this now just because I want to keep on topic, but like I said, this is all covered in the documentation and it's pretty simple to do, to be honest. But getting back to creating our customer, so you'll see here we have a sign up page where we have a pretty basic sign up flow, name, email, and password for the customer. But what I'm actually doing underneath the hood here is on that sign up button, I am, of course, signing the user up. But what I'm actually doing before that is I'm using the Stripe Connect create customer action that comes with the Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin to actually create the customer entity on Stripe for this customer. And then using the result of that, you can see here the result of step one, customer ID, to actually save down the customer ID in my database. So I'm going to sign up a new customer now. So we're going to go with Charles Leclerc, Charles at gmail.com, and we'll just sign up. And we should see two things happen, one in our database and one in Stripe itself. I might just go to Stripe first of all. If we go to our Stripe dashboard, I'm in test mode here, but if we click on customers, we're hopefully going to see a new customer. And sure enough, you can see there, Charles Leclerc, and I realize I spelled Charles wrong in the email, but no big deal. And then if we go back into our database, we should hopefully see a customer ID associated with that new user. And sure enough, I can see here Charles Leclerc with his misspelled email does indeed have a customer ID. And just for reference, you can see here this ends with CRWJ. If I go back to my Stripe dashboard and click on Charles, we will see that that is the customer ID there. So we're taking the customer object and we're saving down the ID associated with it to our Bubble database. Okay, so that's step two done. Let's go back and take a look at step three. So the first thing we're going to need to do is allow customers to make their first payment via a Stripe checkout session. So Obviously, in order to use to save payment details, they first need to provide their payment details at some stage. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up our marketplace so that the first time a customer makes a payment, they're asked to input their credit card. And then after that, we're going to save down those details. And then we're going to use those details so that we can use one-click purchase on future purchases, or we can schedule a payment for a later date and not have to get them to enter their payment details. There's a ton of ways you can do this. But what we're going to do is, let's say Charles is still logged in and he wants to buy this black t-shirt. If we click on purchase here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a checkout session, which is essentially a kind of pre-built Stripe checkout form. And then he's going to be asked to input his payment details. And we'll just do that now. We click on purchase. You see we're brought to this Stripe checkout page. I'm going to put in test details really quickly. And now when I click pay, we're going to be brought back to the home page, and that payment should have gone through. And I'm not going to go into the entire payment flow in detail, but maybe just take a quick look at what actually happened there. If we go to the product page, which is where that payment was made, and we click on this purchase button, we're doing 4 things. First thing we're doing is we're creating a new transaction. You might remember transaction was a data type here that we went over in our database schema. We're leaving it blank, you'll notice initially, but then we're creating a checkout session. So that's essentially what we were brought to, the web page. And again, Stripe Connect create checkout session is an action that comes with the Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin. I'm not going to go into full details on all these fields just because we do have a tutorial video on this, but essentially just to give a quick overview, we're creating the checkout session and we're sending the parameters. So a key one here is actually the Stripe account ID. This is the account ID associated with the seller. So in our case, it was whatever merchant was selling that black t-shirt. They are, after all, are going to get the bulk of the revenue, with our platform taking, I think, a 20% fee in this case. And maybe just check that. Yeah. So you can see here what I'm doing is for the platform fee, I'm taking the price of the product that has been sold and I'm multiplying by 20% to get that value. And indeed, if we go back into transactions and just take a look at that one that went through, we should see under collected fees about $6, which would be about 20%, of the $30 fee. So we're creating the checkout session. We're then making some changes to the transaction where we're saving down the checkout session ID and we're saving down the amount associated with the transaction. And finally, we're navigating to an external website. And what we do is, because we have the Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin installed and we're using that create checkout session action, we have, and I'm just going to replicate it here so you can see, we can put in for our destination, result of step 2, its URL. And that's what brought us to that Stripe checkout page. And that's how we save down the transaction details. So that's useful, but we also want to save down the payment details that the customer used. So if we go back to Charles in our Stripe dashboard, you'll see here he has used his payment method. And what we want to do is we want to save this down so that we can just do like a one-click purchase going forward and he doesn't have to re-enter his details or go to a Stripe hosted form. And the way we're going to do that is we're essentially going to take this payment method. We're going to take the payment method ID associated with it. So again, if I click on this and if we go to this, I believe, you'll see here we've set up this payment method. Payment methods always start with PM. And I'm just wondering if we can see that specifically down here. Yeah, so this is the payment method. So our task now is to figure out how to save this payment method ID down to our database. So next time we want to create a payment or process a payment and split it between our platform and the seller, we can simply use this ID rather than having to, get someone to go to a checkout page. And there's a bit of work here, but it's quite doable. So the first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to go to the settings section of your Bubble editor. You're going to need to go to API and you're going to need to ensure that enable workflow API and backend workflows is enabled, because what we're going to use here is a Stripe webhook to essentially tell our app that once a checkout session is completed, we're going to do a couple of things. And I'm going to go to my backend workflows now. I'll have that option because I've ticked that. And we have here checkout session completed. And what I'm going to do is I am going to recreate this, just so you know yourself. So what I'll do is I'll go to here. We're going to go to new event, and we're going to say checkout, or no, we're going to go to general API workflow, and we're going to call this checkout session done. And in fact, I think I have to use lowercase here. So I'm going to do checkout session done. Okay, we are going to expose it as a public API workflow. This is necessary. We are not going to tick this can be run without authentication, and we are not going to ignore privacy rules when running the workflow. But what we're going to do is once a checkout session is complete, we're going to do a couple of things. I'm just going to click back here so I can take a look. We're making changes to a transaction. We're getting the payment intent ID, then we get the payment method ID, and then the last 4 digits. Perfect. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to get the payment method ID. And this is the kind of ID associated with a specific payment. So what I'm going to do is, before I do that, I need to trigger this backend workflow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here to manual definition, and I'm going to change that to detect request data, and I'm going to click detect data. And this is the URL we're going to use to initialize our webhook. So webhooks, like I may have mentioned, is just a way for Stripe to notify our app that, look, something has happened and do something on the back end in your app. And the way we set up webhooks is you take this URL, which I've just copied. We're going to go back to the developers section of our Stripe dashboard. We're going to go to webhooks. I already have a couple of here, but yours may be blank if this is the first time you're setting up a webhook. We're going to go to click add endpoint, and we're going to type in the endpoint URL. And we are going to listen to events on our account. We are going to select an event, and the event we want to listen to in this specific instance is the checkout session completed, which is checkout session, checkout.session.completed, I should say. So every time someone successfully completes a checkout session, which is what we saw our customer Cheryl do earlier, this webhook is going to be triggered. Now, before I click add endpoint, you may remember just on the API event here, I ticked this, or I left it unticked. This workflow can be run without authentication. There are a number of ways you can authenticate webhooks, and it is recommended. If you search the bubble forums, there's kind of various opinions on the best way. The way I like to do it is by going into the settings tab in my bubble editor, going to API, and you'll see here under API tokens, I've created an API token, and this is really sensitive because it basically gives someone kind of full programmatic access to your app. So you want to be very careful with this, but if you copy this, and then if you go back to your initialize up here, your endpoint URL, I should say, and we add that as a URL parameter at the end, equals, and paste that in. This is essentially authenticating the webhook. So we're now going to be able to initialize it. So I'm going to add that endpoint, and it's waiting. It hasn't actually been run yet. It's waiting for an event. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create and complete a checkout session. But before I do, I need to make sure, and this is really important, that the detect data kind of window is open. If we create and complete a checkout session without having this open, it's not going to initialize the webhook. Okay, so let's go back. We're still logged in as Charles Leclerc. Let's buy some warm socks this time. And we're going to go to purchase. Come back to that purchase one click once we have everything set up. And I'm going to put in some test card details once again. Okay, so once I click pay, I'm hoping the checkout session gets completed and I see something in my backend workflow setup change. So let's click on pay. And let's just wait. And yeah, you can see now that that's been triggered. There are some things you can change here. Dates seem to come in as numbers by default from Stripe and Bubble backend workflows. I prefer having them as a kind of date Unix field. It's not really relevant for our kind of, purposes today, but probably best practice all the same. So we've now initialized that webhook, which is really good. And then we need to make one more change before we can kind of start using the information from this webhook. And that's if we go back to Stripe, we want to go to update details, and we want to delete the initialize part because it has been initialized. We no longer need this. We're going to update the endpoint. And then what we can do is we will now, in our backend workflow, we can make changes to a thing. we can make a change for our transaction. So we're going to do a search for transactions, and we're going to look for the first item. So there's only going to be one, but we're going to look for the first transaction where the checkout session ID is equal to request data's object ID. So what we're saying here is in our database, we have this transaction data type, and you can see this is it here. And we're saying look up all the checkout sessions in our database. Sorry, look up all the transactions in our database and find the only one, which is the first one, where the checkout session ID is equal to the checkout session ID that's been sent by the webhook. And then what we can do is we can say payment intent ID is equal to get data from an external API. Because we have the Stripe Connect Marketplace Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin installed, we have access to all these API calls, and we're going to go to retrieve checkout session details, and the checkout session is going to be equal to this transaction's checkout session ID, and then we have a bunch of fields here we can get, but we're looking for payment intent. So that's going to save down to payment intent. So let's just do that first to make sure everything's working. I'm going to delete this old workflow. So we'll delete that. Now, hopefully, if we create a new transaction, let's buy the warm socks this time, purchase, and again, we'll come back to the one click. We're nearly there. Put in the payment details really quickly. Okay, let's click pay. And we can check if that webhook has been sent through successfully via both our Stripe dashboard, and we're also going to see it in our database. Okay, that's worked. Let's refresh this. Sometimes it takes a second, so we may not see it straight away. Refresh our Stripe webhooks. Okay, great. Yeah, I can see this is the most recent one. It's been sent successfully. And let's see, that's the checkout session ID. So that's how we match it up with the transaction in our database. And the amount was 1,500 cents, which is $15, which is exactly right. Yeah, $15. Okay, so I'm hoping now in our database we have a new transaction, which we do for $15. And we have the checkout session ID. And really crucially, we have the payment intent ID as well. Okay. One thing we don't have, which I probably should have put in, is a seller account ID. So that's the account ID of the merchant that was selling this good. So I'm actually just going to go back and fix that. If we go to our product page, when we're creating that checkout session, I want to go to seller account ID. It's going to be equal to the current page's products, stores, seller account ID. We can also put in currency as well. It's going to put in, I know it's USD in this case, so I can just type that in. You may have dynamic currencies going on, in which case you'll need to make it dynamic, but in my case, I know it's always going to be USD for now. Okay, so don't need to worry about that at the moment, but let's just refresh and keep everything up to date. So we do have the payment intent ID saved down, which is really key, because with that, we can get the payment method. So if we go back to our users, Cheryl actually has this saved down already just because we had the old webhook up and running. So I'm going to delete that for demonstration purposes. But what we can do is we can basically populate this payment method ID field. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to go back to our backend workflow. We're going to go to checkout session completed again. And then we're going to make changes to a thing. We can make changes to the current user because we're on a backend workflow and Bubble has no idea on the backend who is the current user. But what we can do is we can do a search for a user, and we can search for the very first user where their customer ID is equal to request data's objects customer. Now, what's really important here, and something I didn't actually mention earlier, was that we are including the customer ID when we create the checkout session. So again, going back to our product page and looking at the checkout session, you'll see here I'm actually passing through the checkout session here under Stripe customer ID, current user's customer ID Stripe. So that's how we can match it up with what's in our database via the webhook. Okay, let's go back to our backend workflow. Take a look at this workflow here. And okay, that's how we're figuring out which customer to change, which user. And what we're going to do is we're going to say the payment method ID is equal to get data from an external API. We're going to get the payment details this time. We can use the payment intent associated with the transaction we changed in step one. So this is why we needed to change the transaction before updating the user. We needed to get this payment intent ID. And what we can do is we can search for payment method. Okay, cool. So let's refresh our app. Let's take a look at our database. At the moment, Cheryl has no payment method ID saved down, but I'm hoping now when we buy this jumper, next time around, we're going to trigger that webhook. So let's click on purchase, put in our payment details quickly once again. Okay, so we're paying, gone through successfully. Back in our Stripe dashboard, if we refresh, we should see another webhook come through. Sure enough, that's it there. And if we go to our user Cheryl, I'm hoping now we have a payment method saved down, and we do indeed. So that's how we get the payment method. And I know that seems like a lot of work, but it's actually really easy from now on. So what I've done is back on my product page, I've set up another button, and let's just click on black t-shirt this time, just so we can see. So we now have purchase, and this purchase one-click button is now appearing. And what I've done basically is I put a conditional on that button so that it only shows when the current user has a payment method saved down. So let's just take a quick look. Payment method one click. You can see here it's only visible when the current user's payment method ID is not empty. By default, it's not visible. And it's really easy actually to do this. All we need to do is we need to create a new transaction, just like we did on our other payment flow. And then we're using this Stripe Connect create payment intent action, which again comes with the plugin. Now, for the kind of people who are in the weeds of Stripe, you'll know sometimes with Stripe you can set up a payment intent and confirm it in two separate steps. This action does both at once. So the second you run this action, you are effectively processing that payment. It is going through, so just to be aware of that. But again, we're taking the price of the product that we are looking at, we're setting the currency, and then this is why we had to get the payment method ID. This is a really key field. You must save this down here, the payment method ID. We're also using the customer ID. And then because we want to split this payment, it's going to be a destination charge specifically. We're sending 20% of the value to the platform, and the rest is going to the seller, and they are represented by the Stripe account ID here. On behalf of, it's quite an important field. I'm not going to go into details now. We do have documentation on that, but I'm going to leave it as no for now. Okay, so we're creating the payment intent, and then what I'm doing is I'm basically saving down a load of data to the transaction we created, and it's all as a result of step two. So again, because it is action, you've accessed a lot of data from it, the currency, the amount, the payment intent ID. So this time, if I click on purchase one click, you'll see something's happening there in the background. And if we go back to our transactions, we'll see that we now have, I don't think it's gone through yet, give it another second. Yeah, see a new payment has gone through there. They're $30, and we can figure out how much of a fee our platform got for it. And it should be about $6, I think, because we're going for 20%. And then the remainder went to the testor1@gmail.com account. So that's how you can save them payment details and allow a customer to kind of pay in one click. It can also be really useful if you want to schedule a payment. So maybe you want the user to pay 50% initially via a checkout session. You can then schedule a backend workflow to create a payment intent at a later date. We may cover that at a later stage, but you would basically do that, schedule a backend workflow and use a create payment intent action in that backend workflow. Okay, so we've actually gone through the 5 steps involved in creating a payment using save details, and you'll see here in the written guide there are 2 kind of bonus steps that are optional but still recommended. So we're going to take some time to go through them now. The first one is just to implement some handling of potential errors. So a classic example of this would be if a payment method is attached to a customer and becomes invalid for whatever reason. Maybe the card goes out of date, maybe it gets cancelled, whatever it might be. We want to build in some error handling so we don't just get this kind of, mystery error that we never quite see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my workflow here, the purchase one, click one, and I'm going to delete these. You can see I've actually already built this, but we are going to rebuild them in a second. So what we're going to do to test this kind of invalid payment is on this Stripe link, they actually give you some details on how you can add a payment method to a customer and simulate a declined payment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this card here to my Charles Leclerc customer, and then they are going to make a payment that's going to fail. So let's go back into our Stripe dashboard. Let's take a look for Charles. We can see he's here. And what we're going to do now is under payments, I'm going to add another method. I'm going to add a card, and I'm going to put in those details there. So let's just copy that. And for a month and a year, it just needs to be some date in the future. Okay. Okay, and now I'm just going to manually kind of add this payment method into Charles. So again, this isn't obviously how you would do it if you had a real application, but just for argument's sake, I'm going to go back into Charles in my database, and I'm going to replace the payment method that's valid with this invalid one. And I'm going to get him to click on the one-click payment button. Okay, and we're not actually running as him anymore, so let's do that. Go back and find our black t-shirt. Okay, so let's click on purchase one click. Okay, so it looks like everything went through okay. We weren't thrown an error code or anything, but if we go back to our logs in the developer section of our Stripe dashboard, what we should see is that, yeah, we're getting this 402 error. That's basically saying the card was declined. Again, we didn't intend that. But we didn't really see this on the front end in Bubble. But one of the useful things about the create payment intent action with the Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin is we've actually saved down an error message. You can see here we can do result of step 2, and there's a bunch of fields we can choose from, but error message is one of them. And this makes it useful. This is going to be blank if there's no error, but we know there is an error in this case. And let's take a look at our transactions, and you can see here the error message for the most recent transaction was your card was declined. The other thing that can be useful is if we go even further into the transaction data type, well, here you'll see here the status for this one is requires payment method, again because we had an invalid card, whereas for the successful payments, so this one for example, sorry, no, that was a checkout session one. This one here, you can see the status is succeeded. So what you can do is you can use this status to decide on what to show the user. So what I'm going to do is back in my workflow, I'm going to say show an element, and the element I'm going to show is pop-up payment successful, which is just a really simple pop-up I built. But I'm only going to do this when the result of step 2, its status is succeeded. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say show another element, and it's going to be, oh, not a message, delete that. We're going to show an element, and we're going to say we're going to show the pop-up payment failed, but only when the result of step 2, its status is not succeeded. And one more thing we can do just to kind of give some context to the user is you'll see here on the payment failed is I've actually added some dynamic data, and I've added the kind of error message associated with the transaction. So what I can do is just before we show step 5, we can start an action before, and we can display data in a group or pop-up. And again, we'll put it in pop-up payment failed, and we're going to put in the transaction that we're creating in step 1. So now when we refresh, hopefully, again, because we still have this invalid payment method attached to Charles, we're hopefully going to click this. We're going to get a status that is not, it's not succeeded. And then we get this, your payment failed for the following reason, your card was declined. So just useful for giving some context to users if a payment intent doesn't go through. And just to show you how that looks if we do have a valid payment method, let's go back to Charles again. And this time around, let's just pick that valid payment method, take that, save that back down to him. And hopefully this time, just refresh to make sure everything's in line, we should get that payment successful pop-up. Yeah, as we do. So that's useful if you're, creating the payment intent when the user is logged in. Sometimes you may be using this create payment intent action in a backend workflow. In that case, you might want to do something like, let's assume this is a backend workflow. You might want to send an email to yourself, to the admin, to the customer saying your payment was not successful if it doesn't go through. So it's kind of the same logic applies, but you'll need to handle it a bit differently if you're doing this in the backend workflow, because obviously you won't be able to show anything in the front end. Okay, and then our very last kind of step is allow a user to delete a payment method. So what I've done is I've just created this little customer dashboard, and this often happens when you have, a place where you're managing your billing. They're going to show your payment card details. They'll kind of blank out the first maybe 12 and then show the last 4, which I haven't done here. And then you may want to give them the option to delete this payment method. And we can do that, but I suppose our first issue here is we haven't actually saved down the last 4 digits associated with this payment method. Now, thankfully, this is pretty easy to do, and it's going to involve going back to our backend workflow that we went through all the way back in step 3, I believe, or step 4. And we just need to add one more step to this. So you might remember, once a checkout session has been completed, we're making changes to a transaction to get the payment intent. We're then making changes to the user who created that checkout session to get their payment method. And then what we can do is we can also make changes to the user again. In fact, I might just copy this step, make it easier. So we're making changes for that user again, but this time what we're doing is we're saying payment method, last 4 digits, is equal to get data from an external API, retrieve a payment method, and we need the payment method ID for this. So that's going to be the result of step 2. It's payment method ID. And what we want is last card, last 4. So let's refresh our app. This time we're going to have to create a checkout session again just to trigger that backend workflow. So let's go and buy our warm socks and split this $15 between ourselves and the seller. Put in these details quickly. Okay, that's gone through, and our backend workflow should hopefully be receiving that webhook. Then if we go back into our database, what we should see is under users, we should now have, we're getting the last 4 digits associated with the card that Charles had saved down. And then if we go back into the customer dashboard here, we're actually going to see that there. So one last thing I want to cover is just how to give our customers the opportunity to delete this payment method. And there's 2 steps, I guess. Number 1 is deleting the ID from our bubble database. And then number 2, you don't quite delete a payment method in Stripe, rather you detach it from the customer. So what we're going to do is on this delete payment method button, what we're going to do is just click on that. You'll see here, these are the 2 steps effectively. We're first of all using the Stripe Connect detach a payment method action that comes with the Stripe Connect Marketplace plugin to get the current user's payment method ID, pass that through, and then detach it in Stripe. And then we're going to make changes to the user. We're going to reset both their payment method ID and also the last 4 digits. So if I do that here, so you'll see here I'm using some conditional logic to show this text when the user does not have a payment method yet. But that's how you kind of give the user an opportunity to remove a payment method. So that's it. Hope this has been useful. I'm going to link to this demo app, and like I said, the editor is public. I'm going to link to that written guide and some other resources in the description below. But if you have any questions, you can put them in the comments.